Yo guys, I've got a spark which I'm going to use to ignite the fire for a remastered retro video here on the channel. I'm saying it's a remastered retro, not only for the alliteration, because alliteration is awesome, but also for the fact that this is an old video we're looking back to, but more importantly we're improving upon it. Now, this is a 2 lists in 1 video type dealio, so we're not only going to be counting down the top 10 worst Skylanders boss fights, but also the top 10 best Skylanders boss fights, and we're only including stuff from the console iteration, so we aren't going to see any of the 3DS boss fights on here, or any of the mobile boss fights on here. Why would we see any of the mobile boss fights on here? When compared to the console versions, all of those just kind of don't hold a candle, you could go as far to say. And naturally, when it comes to remastering this retro video, what I have left from the video that I made on this exact topic almost 3 years ago is the audio. So I've left all of the audio, which means you guys get a taste of past Ignite when I scripted far less of my videos and I had a few confidence issues, so you'll notice that in my voice, a lot of stuttering, and sometimes I have to repeat myself or go back slightly in what I said, and so naturally it's nice to see a contrast of how my videos were commentated back then and how they are now. It's really great to show the growth and the evolution of the channel in that vein. And when it comes to everything else, the visuals I've updated, I've added music in the background, and I've made slight edits to the audio, slight tweaks. I've added in a few memes here and there to really lighten up the tone, I suppose, especially when we're talking about boss fights that I don't like. So let it be known that this is just my silly personal opinion. I definitely do not expect you guys to agree with me. If you guys like bosses that I have on the worst list, power to you. I'm glad you could find enjoyment in a boss that I personally could not. So we're going to waste no more time. It's just the obvious stuff. If you're going to comment down below, feel free to give me your best and worst boss fights, but please be respectful of each other's opinions. This is simply just a personal expression. We aren't out here to attack anyone or nothing, so let's keep it kind and light-hearted. But enough of my prying. Let's roll that intro and get straight into the top 10 best and worst Skylanders boss fights without further ado.
So as always, we're going to get the negative aspects of the video out of the way first, and that means we're going to start off by counting down the top 10 worst Skylanders boss fights, and that's of course going to start off with Gulper. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this boss fight, especially from a concept standpoint, because this boss can't actually damage you, and you don't actually fight them in a traditional manner. Instead, you're going around puzzling things by destroying vats, platforming over cogs, and of course pushing soda vats into places. A very unique concept for a boss fight, in the fact that, as I said before, you don't actually fight him and he doesn't fight you, at least not directly. Unfortunately though, this boss fight concept does not work for a Doom Raider. I mean, come on guys, these Doom Raiders are supposed to be the big bads in this game. They're supposed to be the ones that provide you real challenges, ones that you dread running into, the ones which absolutely wipe the floor with you during nightmare locks, and this boss just isn't any of that. And it sucks that this is the first Doom Raider in the game, because it's such an easy get around. Like, people with half a brain cell, not to insult them, could defeat this guy. It's a shame that they wasted what could have been such a great concept for any other villain on a Doom Raider. Now, I know this is the first level, but that's no excuse to not give us an epic grand boss fight. Imagine how awesome actually fighting for Gulper would have been to start off the game with. Like, imagine how much of a memorable opening that would have created, rather than just such a lame Doom Raider boss fight. If this was, like I say, for literally any other boss that wasn't a Doom Raider, then it would have been fine. So it's more so like utilising the right concept for the wrong boss fight. At number 9 we have Chaos's evil minions, which of course appear in the Leviathan's Lagoon, Fallen Forest, Creepy Citadel, Lava Lake's Railway, and at the very end of the game. I'm grouping in all of these boss fights into one because they're all practically the same thing, which is where they all have the same inherent flaw because they are so repetitive. They don't have any sort of interesting attack patterns because they attack the exact same way as your regular Skylanders do, so that takes away any sort of intrigue that you could get from the boss fights having some sort of unique patterns behind them, and overall takes away from any sort of surprise because you play as these Skylanders, so being attacked by these same attacks that you utilize on your enemies is ironic. So that's one highlight to the bosses, I suppose, but it just doesn't leave any room for a surprise really, because as I've said, you already know what's coming up, and not to mention the aesthetics are really dull as well. They're literally just one block colour of the elements, so you've got one block green, one block blue, one block black, and one block red. You know, it's not exactly like they're aesthetically pleasing boss fights to go against either, so the repetitive nature combined with the lack of unique aesthetics just makes this boss fight overall not surprising, not memorable, and just an absolute drag to get through each and every time you explore these levels, and end off with such a tame method to acquire an elemental source, mind you. But moving on, we have Blubber Beard. Now you're traversing through a bandit train, constantly jumping between 3D and 2D, taking on a huge slew of challenges and puzzles, and what do you end off with? A incredibly generic pirate boss fight. He's huge, so naturally, well, he's huge and slow, so he's very easy to dodge, and his hitbox is so big that you have no sort of challenge in hitting him whatsoever, so you're ending off a spree of interesting challenges and puzzles with such a generic, easy boss fight. What a letdown. But moving on, we have the Darkness. Yet again, a huge letdown, coming off of a very creative boss fight found in the Chaos from Superchargers, and then ending it off in a vehicle section of all things. Now, I have no problem with the vehicle sections themselves. They're fast-paced and really fun. However, these segments are an absolute drag because there's far too many phases in this boss fight. You go through 3 phases before you move into a completely different plane, which is very creative, mind you, and you're dodging Shadow Guardians, but then you move on to 9 to 15 phases back into the portal network again, which isn't visually pleasing, and again, it's so repetitive it becomes boring and dull after a while. It's such a shame that they ended it off such a great game with a terrible boss fight as tedious as this, as I was previously alluding to. They don't have that feeling of epic or grandness in the end of this because you're too busy being bored stiff from doing the same thing over and over again. But moving on, we have Chaos from Skylanders Giants, or should I say Robo Chaos. Easily one of the worst final bosses of the franchise because once again it's repetitive, it's dull, it's claustrophobic because you go down a straight alleyway whilst Chaos is chasing you, which is one of the most dull things a final boss fight could do. Like, seriously, if you're going to have a chase, at least make it so the road you're being chased down is winding and interesting rather than just a thin, straight corridor of boredom. And then, of course, you can't focus on actually fighting Chaos because instead you have Ghost Robot Friend who's beating him up for you. You just have to attack his fist and his head at points, which isn't what I would call fighting him whatsoever. So instead you're fighting the same Archean enemies which you've fought several times in the game already, so it's not like that's going to be exciting or interesting in any manner whatsoever. But moving on, we have the Fire Viper, an incredibly gross battle because seriously, he eats you and you attack petrified darkness from within his stomach. That is disgusting. I hate having to fight gross boss fights. It's heavily uninvesting and very forgettable, because it grosses me out and I don't want to think about it after it's said and done with. So I hate the grossosity of this fight. I do love the fact that it's oriented around dodging though, so the fact that it has a huge emphasis on the dodging mechanics is pretty fun, but at the same time this can lead to very cheap hits, which is very unfortunate when you're trying to triple star this boss fight, which arguably makes this the most frustrating 3-star boss fight in the entirety of Swap Force. And overall, if it wasn't so gross nor repetitive and tedious, then this boss fight could have easily gotten higher, but this is a perfect place for it because, as I said before, it's gross and it's repetitive and tedious because it's got several phases of you doing the same thing. Oh wow, look, one phase they add in some orange orbs for you to avoid. But moving on, we have Nightshade. I hate the camera angles in this boss fight. They are too wide. You can't see bugger all that's going on, making the boss fight feel very, very frustrating. Worst of all, it's not finished whatsoever because it's very glitchy. And it just isn't all that aesthetically pleasing either. So the fact that this boss fight looks terrible, it plays horribly, just... it's a huge disappointment, really, once again, especially for a Doom Raid of all things. So if they could have gave you much better camera angles on this level and a much more visually pleasing plane to fight upon and better mechanics to fight this villain with, then it easily could have avoided this list altogether. But as it stands, it's just a frustrating boss fight to sit through because it's the camera angles just make it harder than what it needs to be, meaning that when you do have deaths it hardly ever feels like it's your fault, which once again just adds to the frustration of things and makes this boss fight far from fun. But moving on, we have Count Moneybone, which once again I have nothing wrong with the concept of this level, having to fight this enemy with your even with your vehicle and anti-gravity sections. One awesome concept. Unfortunately, the vehicle sections have wacky controls, to say the least, which you're spending all this time getting used to on regular ground, and then it introduces the anti-gravity, which makes the controls even weirder, so that can lead to some very frustrating moments because the controls never feel like they're working with you here. So taking a really awesome concept but applying controls that are already confusing and wacky and giving them anti-gravity based physics results in a very uncontrollable mess of a boss fight, which isn't fun, and it's not that creative either, unfortunately. Outside of the swapping gravity mechanics, this boss fight doesn't do anything unique, besides, you know, creating a fire trail that you need to dodge, which again is very hard due to the dumb controls. But moving on, we have Super Evil Chaos. Now, you remember how I was talking about how the Fire Viper was gross? Well, Super Evil Chaos takes that to the next level because you fight inside his mouth, which is disgusting. You fight inside his brain, which is tiny, and so for this treatment of chaos, this poor treatment of chaos, we are effectively bullying him in a way, and victimizing him just leaves a really distasteful aftertaste, so to say, of this boss fight, because you feel bad, you've effectively bullied chaos. And then the ending is highly climactic. You mash buttons in order to fire a cannon off at Chaos's overly sized head. Meanwhile, to get to there, you are walking to the right. Then you watch Chaos fire, so you walk to the left. Then you walk to the right, and you walk to the left. What a boring, dull way to finish off a game. It's gross, so I don't even like to think about it. It's highly uninspired. It leaves a bad taste in your mouth because of the victimization of Chaos. Sure, he's the villain, but do we really need to become villains ourselves in bullying the villain? So overall, this is just a really lame way to end off, once again, what is an amazing game. But the worst boss fight in the Skylanders franchise has to go to Dreamcatcher. This boss fight is an absolute joke. It ends off Telescope Towers from Skylanders Trap Team with a Doom Raider, which once again should offer up a challenge and a boss fight that you should dread, but I dread nothing about going into the Dreamcatcher boss fight. All you need to do while she is invulnerable to your attacks is jump off a ledge so that then she re-triggers her bed protection animations so that then you can attack the beds and make her vulnerable again whilst she is completely out of an attack pattern and not attacking you back. She's too busy blabbering off, which first of all isn't charismatic whatsoever. It gets on your nerves, the fact that she talks so much in such an annoying accent is not characterizing of her whatsoever. So we're going to end off this video with the top 10 best Skylanders boss fights, because I want to end off this episode on a positive note, and of course there's no better way to generate said positive note than with the best boss fights of the franchise. So starting us off is Chaos Sandra. So really with this boss fight I do have problems to where it's just a bunch of enemies that you're fighting, you know, a bunch of goop balls that you're dodging, very generic-esque stuff when it comes to the combat of the game. However, this level has a really interesting gimmick behind it to where you need to take your scanner off and you find Chaos Sandra hiding within the portal, and of course the lead up to that, the suspense, just for music kind of cutting out, creating almost kind of like a heartbeat, and you and creating a sense of mystery as you don't really know where she is, and then once you finally find out where she is hiding through the portal, which of course has its blinking light up effects, the same as Chaos Sandra's little tiny portal at the top screen. It's just a really clever way to build up to this kind of surprise, and ultimately it builds atmosphere, which makes the surprise all the more rewarding, and it's just a really interesting mechanic that they built into the boss fight to make it very, very memorable, mind you. So that's why this boss fight here is at number 10, not because of the actual boss fight itself, it's quite generic in the content, however it makes up for that with the very unique and creative mechanic utilized. Number 9 is going to be Golden Queen. Now, if this boss fight takes advantage of everything you've been learning from the Skylanders mechanics up until this point, you need to jump, you need to run, you need to dodge, and you need to do it quickly. So because of that, the boss fight is very well paced, and because it's difficult, it feels rewarding to beat, and it's also creative. You know, you have a plethora of different golden objects which you go from shooting to jumping over to dodging. So above all, this boss fight keeps you on your feet and constantly invested in the game you're playing, because you're paying such close attention to the boss fight which you so desperately want to beat. But number 9 is going to be Chaos from Spyro's Adventure. Now, this is a very challenging boss fight. I remember that when I originally had a limited palette for the first run round this boss, I only had the starter pack characters Boomer and Ghost Roaster alike, and utilising only those 5 Skylanders, I could not beat this boss fight for the life of me because it was so damn challenging, and I love that. I also love the fact that it takes advantage of everything that the game has been teaching you up until this point, such as the different elemental objects that you need to dodge. So above all, the fact that it culminates all of the mechanics that you've learned, and, you know, rewards your memory of the game and your previous investments. It's just ultimately what makes this boss fight an absolute blast to play through, and once again it's challenging, so I'm glad that they ended off this game on such a high note with such a glorious challenge that's so rewarding to beat, mind you. They could have made it piss easy, and if the boss fight would have been much less memorable for it. So I'm glad that this boss fight was as great as it was, especially to close off the first game of the franchise in such a positive manner. But next up is going to be the Rock Giant, also from Spyro's Adventure. Now, I love the design of this boss fight. It's very well designed. It's also really unique within the context of Spyro's Adventure, because most of the boss fights are very repetitive, as we've talked about previously. So having a fresh new design spliced into the mix is just something that makes this boss fight all the more memorable, and it takes full advantage of the fact that you can't jump, because now you need to dodge falling rocks and avoid the lines of boulders so that then you can leave the Rock Giant exposed and vulnerable. It's just a really clever execution of the game's mechanics to make for a very satisfying, well-designed boss fight that's very memorable in every meaning of the word. However, moving on, we have Jumpy Mage from Skylanders Giants. Now, once again, this boss fight takes advantage of the fact that you can't jump in this game, so you must dodge all of these different pallets that come flying towards you and swap between the two worlds in order to constantly switch between pallets that damage you and pallets that heal you. It's a very clever utilization of the mechanics of the level, as well as the mechanics of the Skylanders Giants gameplay in general, and it makes the boss fight all the more intense and investing, because there is no easy way out of dodging these pallets. You can't jump over them unlike you can in other Skylanders games, which is why the jumping mechanic kind of of sucks in terms of its exploration within boss fights, mind you. So yeah, I'm really glad that this boss fight took such great advantage of the mechanics at hand, and it also gave us a very charismatic villain, because Jumpy Mage has such a fresh and unique personality amongst all of the other villains to generally just invest you further into this boss fight and give you an absolute blast of a time. It's also fast paced, so due to that pacing, the boss fight isn't boring and doesn't drag, making it once again another great ending to a especially great level. But moving on, we have Wolfgang. Now this is yet again another very intense boss fight, lots of things going on at once. You have to dodge lasers in a 2D plane whilst also dodging Wolfgang's attacks, whilst also finding an opening to attack him with. So this can be a bit of a problem if you struggle with focusing on multiple things at once, but that challenge is what makes it so investing. And because you're maintaining your concentration throughout, you're constantly invested in the boss fight. You have Wolfgang's awesome charisma to go alongside it, making this boss fight as a whole feel fresh and unique within the concept of this game. And overall, it's just an absolute blast to play through such a fun boss fight that has fun patterns for you to avoid and for you to find openings of. And of course, because it's challenging, it once again rewards you for doing well, and that feeling, that rewarding feeling even, ultimately makes the boss fight even more satisfying to sit through. But next up, we're going to have the evil sea monster. Easily the best boss fight in the Hall of Imaginators, because this guy's loops actually have some sort of creativity to the way he attacks you. You know, he creates these huge splash pools of goop. He tries to chomp at you, so overall it's how fresh this boss fight feels, once again within the context of this game that has some very, very bad boss fights. So this boss fight stands out as a result due to the memorable patterns it partakes in, and for just genuine creativity put into the boss itself and the design there, as well as the patterns that he attacks you with. And I also love the atmosphere here too, because you know, you're paying attention to the goop whilst you're platforming to look out for the sea monster whilst he's trying to ambush you. So again, that suspense built is very intriguing and invests you further into the boss fight, so to say. But next up, we have Mesmerelda. Oh boy, is this villain charismatic. We start off her boss fight with a little sing-song, which automatically makes the boss fight memorable, because who doesn't like a good bit of singing now, right? Of course, the patterns and the attacks she utilizes take full advantage of everything that you've learned in previous levels, i.e. for Frostfest Mountains in this case, because you've got to worry about explosive chickens, singing dancers, puppets being thrown at you. So the fact that you have so much to dodge keeps you at constant investment in the boss fight and just makes it so much fun. And better yet is that this entire boss fight is an extension of Mesmerelda's personality, so it just brings more character to the villain and makes it even more satisfying and rewarding when you finally beat her, mind you. But moving on to number 2, we have Drillex, yet again another villain that sings. Surely you see a pattern here. But what makes Drillex slightly better than Mesmerelda is the fact that he has slightly better patterns when it comes to his attacks, because each phase is varied and memorable in their own right, because they take full advantage once again of the fact that you can't jump in giants, so you have to use bounce pads to go over. For drill, whilst it spins, you need to use cover in order to avoid debris as it's launched at you. It's just a very clever execution of for dodging mechanics within the Skylanders and not being able to jump over attacks so easily, which adds another layer of difficulty to this boss fight, once again making it rewarding and satisfying to beat. And you're just really heavily invested in Drillex's character, mind you, because he's a singing drill. That's so awesome and investing that you can't help but get his song out of your mind, and by extension for the entire boss fight out of your mind. So memorability there, and the freshness within the boss fight and the personality it displays ultimately makes Drillex the second to best boss fight within the entire Skylanders franchise. But easily my favourite boss, on the other hand, has to be the Chaos iteration from Skylanders Trap Team. Now, I love the design of this villain. It reminds you of the traps, which is of course this game's whole gimmick. So once again, it feels like this is the culmination of everything you've learned thus far in the game to create for a really epic boss fight. It's long, it's dragged out, and in this case that really works because it makes the final fight feel grand and earned when you've finally beaten Chaos. It's also incredibly challenging, easily the hardest boss fight in the entire series, and I love having some sort of challenge in Skylanders, so seeing that by extension here is just an awful lot of fun. And the music also adds to the whole atmosphere of the stage, making it feel so grand and epic in all of its gloriousness. So it truly is the end of an epic journey here. And the entire game of Skylanders Chapter feels like an absolute odyssey. So having that end with such an amazing and challenging boss fight is ultimately the cherry on top of the cake of what's an already amazing game. So that's what makes Chaos from Trap Team my favourite Skylanders boss fight without a shadow of a doubt.
With that being said and done, this video is coming to an end, and I want to thank you all so much for watching. By merely clicking on this video, you've shown support and helped it garner recognition so it can reach many of the viewers here on YouTube. I'd love to see you take the extra step and leave a like on the video if you enjoyed. Also be sure to comment below and push that subscribe button whilst you're down there. By clicking elsewhere on screen, you can either check out a video that's specifically picked out for you, or you can check out the rest of the playlist for a series you just watched. Before ending off, I'd like to thank all of my Blazing Knights and Scorching Dragons whose support help make these videos possible. I'll be seeing you in the next video, and until that moment arises, peace!